So for today's presentation, I'm exploring kind of this different aspect of neuroscience or the nervous system. And I say different because, it doesn't involve the typical parts of the nervous system that we think about. So when I say the word nervous system, you probably picture the brain, maybe the spinal cord, neurons firing, something like that. And that's all correct, of course, but today I want to introduce you to a part of the nervous system that almost nobody talks about outside of a medical school classroom. And I think that's a mistake because once you understand what this part of the nervous system does, it changes how you think about your mood, your decisions, your digestion, even, and what scientists are now calling one of the most exciting frontiers in modern neuroscience. So, the idea here is that you have two brains. I'm going to dive deep into the second one, the one that you don't normally hear about in this talk today. So you already know about the one in your head, but tonight I want to introduce you to the other one. Lining the walls of your entire gastrointestinal tract, I know it sounds weird, it's not the brain or the spinal cord or anything, it's the gastrointestinal tract. From your esophagus all the way down to your colon, it's a vast independent network of more than 500 million neurons. 500 million. For comparison, your entire spinal cord contains about 100 million. So this network in your gut it has 5 times more neurons than the thing that connects your brain to the rest of your body. Let that sink in for a second. This network is called the enteric nervous system. And what makes it very remarkable is that it doesn't just assist your brain with digestion, it can sense, process, and respond to information entirely on its own without asking your brain for permission first. Now, researchers have called it your second brain, and that's not necessarily a metaphor, actually. It's a literal description of what it does structurally and functionally. And by the end of this session, I think you'll agree that that name is earned. So let's get into what this thing actually looks like anatomically because the numbers are worth sitting with. So 500 million neurons in a network embedded in the gut wall. And to put that in context, that's roughly the same number of neurons as a cat's entire brain sitting in your abdomen right now, running its own operations. Now, the enteric nervous system, or the ENS, as its abbreviation is embedded in two thin layers of tissue that line every part of your digestive system: the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the colon. And these aren't just relay stations for the brain. They contain the full circuits, sensory neurons that detect the chemical composition, acidity, and physical stretch of whatever's inside the gut, motor neurons that coordinate muscle contractions, and interneurons connecting them all. Exactly the same basic architecture as your central nervous system. Now, here's the thing that consistently surprises people when they hear it. Researchers have cut the vagus nerve, the main cable connecting the gut to the brain, in animal models, and the gut kept digesting perfectly normally. It doesn't miss a beat. That fact alone tells you that this isn't a passive system that's taking orders from above. It's an autonomous system. It's like a brain that works on its own. So where does this system come from, and why does it have so many neurons in the first place? The answer to that goes back to the very beginning, which is embryonic development. The ENS and the central nervous system, the CNS, share the same embryonic origin. They both develop from something called neural crest cells, which is a population of cells that form early in development and then migrate to different parts of the body to build different parts of the nervous system, essentially. And a portion of those cells migrate down into the gut wall and form the enteric nervous system independently. So when you're asking why the gut has a nervous system at all, the answer is essentially because it was there first, evolutionary speaking, And it really precedes a lot of the rest of the nervous system, which is quite astonishing because, again, that's not the parts you would think about when you hear the word nervous system. So the gut is essentially one of the oldest organs in the body, and its nervous system reflects that. Now, the vagus nerve connects these two systems, roughly 100,000 nerve fibers running between your brainstem and your gut. But here's a detail that tends to flip people's intuitions. About 80 to 90% of those fibers run upward from the gut to the brain, not the other way around. So, believe it or not, the gut is doing most of the talking in this relationship. The brain is mostly listening. So, that might be one of the most astonishing facts about this whole thing. Now, I want to express this idea with you that digestion is a neural symphony. And now let's actually watch the enteric nervous system in action, because I think this is where it gets genuinely beautiful. Every single time you eat something, the ENS orchestrates a coordinated neural performance that your conscious mind has absolutely zero involvement in. Before your brain even registers that you've eaten, the sensory neurons in the gut wall have already detected the composition of what you swallowed. Is it acidic? Is it fatty, dense? How much of it is there? And started signaling the appropriate response to all this. Motor neurons then take over and coordinate peristalsis, which is the rhythmic wave of muscle contractions that move food through about 9 meters of digestive tract that's coiled in your abdomen. 9 meters. And this has to happen with precise timing, coordinated in the right direction at the right speed, adjusted for what the gut is currently digesting. So there's a lot that has to go right, a lot that has to play along together to create this neural symphony. And the enteric nervous system is managing all of this in real time. It's like the conductor, but the conductor that's also controlling all of these organs, all of these nerves, all these parts that go together anatomically, is controlled by the enteric nervous system at the same time, which is quite impressive. And is also simultaneously controlling the release of digestive enzymes, such as the ones that aid in a lot of the breaking down of food that happens inside your stomach after you swallow it, which then leads to many other processes in the intestines, like absorbing the food, taking it to waste, everything. So this is a crucial part of that entire process that the enteric nervous system actually controls the release of these digestive enzymes. It also controls mucus production and blood flow to the gut wall. So these are all controlled by the same thing. So you can begin to see now how active this system really is. And the crazy thing about this is that there's absolutely no conscious input required. I mean, when have you ever thought about actively digesting your food that's made it to your abdomen? No instructions from the brain are needed for this. The second brain handles all of it, which is probably a good thing, because if your prefrontal cortex had to manage peristalsis on top of everything else you're already asking it to do, you'd be in a lot of trouble. That's way too much for one lobe of the brain, one part of the cortex to handle at the same time. Now let's talk about the gut-brain highway that runs both ways between your brain and your gut. It's a very interesting relationship that exists between these two systems, because this is where the clinical and psychological implications begin to kick in. The gut and brain communicate constantly via the vagus nerve, and that communication is bidirectional, but the direction is wildly unequal. Remember, 80 to 90% of vagal fibers go from the gut to the brain, not the other way around. So the gut is continuously sending status updates upward, hormone levels, immune markers, inflammatory signals, nutrients, absorption data, information about the microbial environment in the guts. These are all conveyed through that gut brain highway, which is the vagus nerve. And those signals shape things that you would never associate with your gut, your mood, your energy levels, your baseline perception of stress or safety. That gut feeling that we say in pop culture, it's about a situation that's instinctive sense that something is off, for instance, or that something feels right. That is literally a signal traveling up the vagus nerve. It's measurable and it's real. So when we say gut feeling, in the normal conversations that we have, it's quite literal, actually. It's not very metaphorical. So in the other direction, the brain sends signals down to the gut, obviously, but that's only 10 to 20% of the channel. And you don't often see that with the brain. It's usually the brain that's sending signals out. But in this case, only 10 to 20% of this channel involves signals that are sent from the brain. And this is mostly about regulating gut activity in response to your emotional states. So something like stress tightens the guts. It slows or speeds digestion, changes its sensitivity, and that's the brain talking downward. But the gut is doing the bulk of the broadcasting in this relationship, and I think most people have it completely backwards. So thankfully for all of you who are here today, you're not going to have that backward, because now you know that the gut actually sends 80 to 90% of the signals to the brain. Now let's talk about this hormone that you've heard, I'm sure, many, many times, serotonin, and it plays a very big role here, especially. So 90% of your serotonin is made in your gut. And, this is, I think, one of the statistics that I think is quite counterintuitive, probably the most counterintuitive statistic in this talk for sure. That 90% of your body's serotonin is made in your gut and not your brain. Now, I want to be careful here because this gets misrepresented a lot. Gut serotonin and brain serotonin are not in the same pool, actually. They're largely separated by the blood-brain barrier. So gut-produced serotonin doesn't directly become the serotonin affecting your mood in the way pop science sometimes implies. They're different systems, actually. Same molecule, just different systems. But in the gut, serotonin is doing something that is critically important. It acts as the primary signaling molecule for the enteric nervous system. It triggers muscle contractions, regulates how fluids are secreted, and sends sensory signals up to the vagus nerve. So when the enteric nervous system serotonin signaling is disrupted by something like infection, by inflammation, or a disrupted microbiome, it affects everything from your bowel function to the signals that reach your brain. And here's why this matters in a clinical sense. People with depression or anxiety have disproportionately high rates of gut symptoms, and people with gut disorders have disproportionately high rates of mood disorders and mood swings. So the enteric nervous system, the serotonin system that's in the enteric nervous system, essentially is a significant part of why those two things are so entangled. And I think this is a very interesting area of research, one that's certainly a hot topic today in neuroscience. Now, the enteric nervous system does not work in isolation either. It's in constant contact with roughly 38 trillion microbial cells, the gut microbiome essentially, which lives right on the other side of the gut wall. And this is where it gets quite fascinating. Gut bacteria are not passive passengers. They actively produce neurotransmitters like the brain does. They make GABA, dopamine precursors, and short chain fatty acids that directly activates the ENS neurons. These are essentially bugs talking to neurons, and the neurons are the ones here that are listening. That's quite insane. And we know this because of germ-free animal studies. Animals that are raised with quite virtually no microbiome in their guts um, exhibits a lot of these things that have informed us about this relationship between um, microbes and neurons, because with these animals that have virtually no microbiome, you're going to have no kind of communication, obviously, between germs and neurons taking place. And with that microbiome taken away, you're going to begin to see the impacts that has on an animal's nervous system and how neurons themselves are affected by that. So what happens here, it's quite complicated, but to put it quite simply, these animals tend to develop a sort of abnormal enteric nervous system. So they have actually fewer neurons, altered signaling, obviously, and they also notably have different anxiety-like behavior compared to animals who have a normal microbiome. So the microbiome, as you can tell by now, it's not just along for the ride, it's actively shaping the structure and function of your second brain. And the disruption can happen quite fast. Studies show that antibiotics or a poor diet can alter enteric nervous system signaling within days, which is not an argument against ever taking antibiotics. Obviously, take them when you have to, but it is an argument for taking seriously what you feed these systems. I mean, after all, this is where things like superbugs emerge from, and that's one of the last things you'd want. Now, let's talk about what happens when this system goes wrong, because this is where the clinical picture starts to get very significant. And as you can tell from looking at this slide, it has this dark theme, which speaks to the downside of this enteric nervous system and the things that can happen when things don't go the way they're supposed to. So you've probably heard of IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which affects somewhere around 10 to 15% of the global population, which is actually a lot of people. That's about 1 billion people, if we're going by today's population. So for a long time, it was treated as primarily a psychological condition. People were told it was just stress or anxiety, or that they were imagining it somehow. But research obviously changed that, dispelled all of that. And what we now know as a result is that IBS involves hypersensitive ENS neurons that amplify normal gut signals into pain. It is considered a nervous system disorder, not just psychological, and it belongs in the same category as a migraine or neuropathy. So these are conditions where the signaling system itself has become dysregulated, not just the organ that it controls. And beyond IBS, there's growing evidence that ENS disruption, or the gut-brain axis dysfunction, is involved in Parkinson's disease, which is obviously a very significant disease, where researchers have actually found the hallmark of protein aggregates in the gut before they appear in the brain. And they also appear in things like depression, anxiety disorders, and autism spectrum conditions as well. These are not fully established causal links yet, I have to say, but they are serious research directions being pursued at major institutions globally. The gut is not just downstream of the brain, as you can tell. In many disorders, it may be where the signal breaks down first, which just speaks to how important DNS is in many things that involve the nervous system and your overall health. So let's talk about now what you can do to take care of this second brain that you have in your guts. And you might be wondering, what is this? What does any of this mean practically? Because I never want to give a talk on neuroscience that ends at interesting, just being interesting without actually being useful too. A common theme between these talks that I've given is that I want to give some useful information that can actually benefit you practically. So I want to leave you with some tips here that can help you take care of the second brain, because in the past almost 10 slides, you've learned how important it is and how important it must be to actually take good care of it. So 4 things worth actually doing with this. First, and this is quite, intuitive, is to feed your microbiome. You need diverse, fiber-rich foods that can feed the bacteria that are in direct conversation with the ENS neurons. Because what you eat is not just fuel, it's information for a very big and complex neural system, in the case of the ENS being 500 million neurons. So that framing should change the way you think about your diet. Obviously, your diet is important for many things, your overall health, and many of your other organ systems. But as you can see, feeding your microbiome with that good, diverse, rich, nutritious food is one of the most important things that you can do for your overall health. Second is to manage your stress intentionally, because stress plays a big part in this system, and it can disrupt it in more ways that you can possibly imagine. I'm not talking about just the kind of temporary stress that you have on a day-to-day basis. I'm talking about chronic stress, when it actually becomes long-term and begins to cause a lot of problems in your body. ENS is no different. It's also altered a lot by stress. So chronic stress specifically alters ENS sensitivity structurally. And it's not just that stress feels bad. I mean, it changes the hardware. Slow, deep breathing activates the vagus nerve and directly modulates gut-brain signaling. It lowers that stress. Exercise, for instance, does the same thing. Sleep does the same thing. These aren't just wellness cliches. They're literally interventions on the gut-brain axis that can regulate its function and lower disruption as much as possible. Third is to take gut systems seriously. Persistent IBS, bloating, or nausea are often not just digestion issues. They can be broader ENS signaling problems with real consequences for mood and cognitive function. So it doesn't just affect the digestion, obviously, it also affects what's happening up here in your head, which again speaks to just how important it is to take these steps to take care of the system. They deserve clinical attention in the same way that any other neurological symptom would. So that is something to really take seriously. And fourth, my fourth and final tip is to trust the gut signal. That literal gut feeling I talked about, it's a real measurable neural signal traveling, up to 80 to 90% of the vagus nerve to your brain. So your gut is continuously briefing your brain on your internal world. It's really earned a seat at that table, and it really plays a huge part in that communication that takes place with the brain. So I want to leave you with this. Um, your gut isn't just digesting food, it's processing information constantly at a high rates, and from many different parts um, of the system, of the broader nervous system, really, which, as you know, is a massive system, probably the most complex system in your body, definitely the most complex, actually. So it's doing a lot more than just digesting food. It's producing neurochemicals, like serotonin. Again, 90% of serotonin is produced in your guts, not your brain. So that's one of the many things that should signal just how important this system is. And it's sending your brain a continuous signal about what your internal world looks like, really. And that's quite powerful. Um, it's something that you shouldn't sleep on. And I mean, researchers for many, many years have slept on that, and slept on this entire system, the enteric nervous system, and your gut brain axis. I mean, I wouldn't blame them. You wouldn't typically associate with your gut with your nervous system or your brain. But now we know the incredibly powerful role that it plays in regulating our emotions and in signaling how we feel to the brain. It does a lot of things uh, that you may not even realize. Um, your second brain is really like a second brain. That's not an exaggeration. It's really like a brain. Obviously, not as complex as your actual brain, but the fact that it works on its own, the fact that it has 5 times more neurons than your spinal cord, um, it really acts as a brain that you would see in another animal like a cat's that's not as complex as ourselves, but after all, it is a brain sitting right there in your guts, which sounds weird, but it's true. Um, and the thing is, it doesn't write essays or solve questions, obviously, like what you do uh, using your cognitive functions and your prefrontal cortex and your actual brain in your head, but it has something equally important, and that is a direct line to everything you feel, your mood, your baseline sense to, you know, threats in your environments or your safety, your instincts about situations. All of that is shaped by this network, this incredibly complex and vast network of 500 million neurons that most people don't know exists. And I think that truly matters, not just scientifically, but practically, because when we talk about mental health, when we talk about mood disorders, when we talk about stress and anxiety, we've been looking at only one half of the story, essentially. The second brain has been part of that conversation all along since our earliest days. Again, it's older than much of the rest of the nervous system. And now we're only beginning to uncover a lot of what it does. So that's what I want to leave you with today. Some food for thoughts. You can look into this more. I suggest researching more about the enteric nervous system and that literal gut feeling that we all have, and how your guts affects your brain and vice versa. I think that's all a very hot area of research today in neuroscience and also more broadly in related fields. And I would suggest looking into this more. This is just kind of a fundamental talk on the enteric nervous system, this second brain that you have. But this was just meant to provide you with that foundational information. And hopefully now, after this talk, you're going to go and look into it more. So I'd love to open it up for questions. Thank you all for listening to my talk, the second one that I've had at this edition of STEMQuest. And I absolutely loved learning about it myself and also presenting what I learned to you. The floor is open. You can ask anything from the anatomy of this system to the microbiome research to the clinical side, whatever's on your mind, just shout it out, type it in the chats. You know the drill. So go ahead. it's your turn to talk. And if you can't think of any questions now, um, if you have me on WhatsApp, you can text me there about any questions about this topic, or you can shoot me an email, which I just sent in the chats. Feel free to ask me any questions there about this topic or anything else. Thank you, Tirsa, for joining us, and thank you everyone else. I'll be here for a couple more minutes if you have any questions that pops up in your head.